We now have the pleasure of hearing from Professor Desmond Cahill, OAM. Professor Cahill is an emeritus professor at RMIT University in Melbourne and the moderator of the Asian Conference of Religions for Peace. He was honored with the Medal of the Order of Australia in the year 2010 for his contributions to intercultural education and interfaith activities. Professor Cahill.
Well, may I begin by thanking you for the invitation to speak today to you. I think it's very important that we hold this seminar in the Vedanta Hall, which is associated, of course, with Ramakrishna and with Swami Vivekananda, whose photograph is on the back wall there immediately in front of me. And of course, Swami Vivekananda is famous for the speech he gave in 1893 at the first Parliament of the World's Religions, in which he began with the words, "Sisters and brothers." And I think that he was there in Chicago. And in less than 4 hours' time, another Chicagoan, Robert Prevost, will be formally enthroned as the next Pope. So, Chicago. Firstly, may I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, the Gadigal people of the Eora tribe. Our First Nations peoples are the original discoverers, the original settlers, and the original pioneers of this vast and ancient land. I began researching migration movements, multicultural and multi-faith societies 48 years ago. And with my first book, Initial Adjustment to Schooling of Immigrant Families, written with my mentor, the Jewish Professor Ronald Taft, who only died last year at the age of 103. I'm very pleased to see the title of this seminar, From Race Discrimination to Social Harmony, because I've always had difficulty with the concepts of race and racism, because the emphasis on skin color does not do full justice to the inner dignity and full humanity of the human person. In a few weeks' time, on June the 11th, we'll celebrate 50 years since the passing of the Racial Discrimination Act by the Federal Parliament. Race and race discrimination were a part, but not an overly large part of the academic conversation during the 1970s and the 1980s, until the early 90s, when the conversation focused on whiteness and racial discrimination. White people, such as myself, were generally called Anglo-Celts. Besides racism, there are other words that were used: discrimination, exclusion, prejudice, intolerance, sectarianism, bigotry, and so on. And I'm reminded of the very important document published in July 1989, a national agenda for a multicultural Australia, published by the Office of Multicultural Affairs within the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And in his foreword, Bob Hawke wrote, "The document expresses the goals, priorities, and strategies that the government considers necessary in order to promote respect for individual identity, to ensure social cohesion and to enhance social justice. The multicultural agenda was built around the three dimensions of cultural identity, social justice, and economic efficiency, together with 8 goals as their underlying principle, led by the first that all Australians should have an overriding and unifying commitment to Australia, to its interests and future first and foremost. I begin my thoughts today on social cohesion and Australia's multicultural profile by noting that Islam was practiced in Australia before Christianity by the Macassan fishermen who visited Australia's northern shores for several months each year in search of sea slug trepang. The Aboriginal oral histories clearly tell of the practices of Islam, and it probably goes back about to the 1500s, if not before. With 1788 and the onset of British colonialism, racism and exclusion were wrapped up in settler colonialism with the land dispossession, systemic violence, and extreme marginalisation. The late Lyndall Ryan, who died about 12 months ago, in her life's great work, documented the 438 massacres, especially from the 1820s for another 100 years, perhaps even into the 1930s. Only 13 were retaliatory massacres of colonialists. There were over 10,000 victims, of whom 97.3% were Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. The last massacres occurred in the 1920s and 30s, and since then, a cult of forgetfulness has enveloped this dreadful part of our Australian history, which the Aboriginal truth-telling thing will try and overcome. The various research studies suggest that contemporary Australian discrimination, exclusion, and racism is enveloped by a cult of denial, reflecting a trio of factors. Firstly, religious and linguistic hierarchies and power imbalances deep in Australian society. Secondly, the silencing of expressions of lived experience of discrimination, not least in the employment sector. And thirdly, the fundamental injustice of not being heard. Formal reporting of words and actions that contravene the Racial Discrimination Act have not been found to be a positive experience because of the fear of the consequences, the lack of trust in statutory authorities, and the fear of not being heard. Hence the low rate of reporting. But since October the 7th, 2023, the anti-Semitic and Islamic registers have unfortunately registered a big increase in incidents. Exacerbating this, faith and religion were not part of the Racial Discrimination Act, though periodically the Human Rights Commission holds an inquiry into freedom of religion and belief, and that's the one that several of us did in 2011. The Racial Discrimination Act introduced by Scott Morrison has been in limbo and will remain there. This has become more important, and we must find new ways of addressing both discrimination based on religious affiliation and discrimination committed by religious groups. Why is all this so important? Because in the past 2 decades, Australia's religious profile has changed considerably, as seen in the little thing that you've been given, comparing the 1996 and the 2021 census figures. And you'll notice there how the Islam now is the 3rd largest religion in Australia after Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. And you see the big increase in Hindus, particularly over the last 20 years as a result of the huge Indian and South Asian migration to Australia, particularly to Melbourne, and the phenomenal increase in the last 10, 15 years of Sikhism, not least to Melbourne. So the features of these figures are that Australia is no longer majority Christian. The Christian proportion of the population has declined from 70.9% in 1996 to 43.9% in 2021. And I could talk much more about that. The second is, as I've just mentioned, the strong rise in followers of the faiths other than Christian. Now, 1 in 10 Australians belongs to a faith other than Christian. Buddhists have continued their steady growth, as seen in the 2021 figures. The third major development, of course, is the huge growth in non-believers. To be, in 2021, 38.9% of the population. That's almost 10 million people. So Religions for Peace Australia is now advocating, because of these changes, for a Multifaith Council of Australia to be formed. And events in recent years have highlighted this. Firstly, the pandemic, when religious leaders, particularly in New South Wales and South Australia, played an important part, firstly in closing their places of worship, then encouraging their communities to be vaccinated against their natural hesitancy and the misinformation of the anti-vaxxers. Climate change and the impact on Australia. The work of groups such as Green Faith and ARC, stands for the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. Thirdly, Australia's First Peoples and their place in Australian societies, led by Professor Anne Patel-Gray, the leading Aboriginal theologian, who's playing a role with us in Religions for Peace. Fourthly, the social media misinformation and disinformation, to try and prevent that through a multi-faith council. The impact of overseas events, the war in Ukraine, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and so on. And lastly, combating bad religion bad religious practice, and abuse within faith communities. So I think for all these reasons, we feel in Religions for Peace Australia that we need a multi-faith Council of Australia, and we've been consulting with senior religious leaders all around Australia. I want to finish off by drawing your attention to an important book, The Economic Impact of Religion on Society in Australia, recent research and commentary edited by Keith Thompson. And he's drawing on a whole lot of data sets to show the economic contribution that faith communities make to Australia's economy and its social capital. And in it, there's a very important article by Professor Ram Kannan of the University of Pennsylvania and Australian Research, validating that people who go to their place of worship on a regular basis, weekly or perhaps monthly, these studies show that they have an important result in terms of quality of life in the following areas. And I can elaborate on these later on if you wish me to. Preventing suicide. Religious people are less likely to commit suicide. Helping people find employment. In 2017, the Catholic Church employed 220,000 people across Australia in 3,500 Catholic organisations, obviously led by the schools and the hospitals. Job training. Crime prevention. Religious people don't commit crime. Ending alcohol and drug abuse. Enhancing health and reducing the cost of illness. Caring for the elderly while the families work. Helping immigrants and refugees. Preventing divorce. Religious people are less likely to divorce. Teaching pro-social values to children and young people. The social services provided by faith communities that I've already mentioned. And lastly, giving and volunteering, that religiously committed people, it's well known in Australia, are more likely to volunteer. So in conclusion, the evidence is building up that strongly suggests that it would be timely to establish the Multifaith Council of Australia. The senior religious leaders in Australia are all for it. New South Wales has given the lead with its own New South Wales Faith Affairs Council. Social cohesion would be enhanced by bringing Australia's religious and social capital together in addressing the many challenges facing the Australian nation now and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Carl. That was wonderful.
Racism has no place in Australia. We really need to dismantle it completely. I'd like to discuss deeper about spirituality, not religion. Spirituality can offer deeper connection via art, music, nature, and other linkages. The fastest growing religions are Hinduism and Buddhism, and as you mentioned earlier, no religion. But if you mention spirituality, you do find people open up. So my question to you is, how can we improve spirituality? How can we do away with racism?
Yeah, I didn't mention spirituality in my speech, but that's because I didn't have that much time. But behind every faith, major faith, or religion, whatever word you want to use, there are many spiritualities of varying shades and colors. And I did mention in passing ego spirituality, which many Australians have, because of their reverence for our natural resources, our natural beauty, and so on. So it's not surprising. I think my idea, or not just my idea, but Religions for Peace Australia is pushing for a multi-faith council of Australia, is precisely to help in nourishing the various spiritualities, and there are many, and particularly Aboriginal spirituality, which I didn't mention. And within our plans for a multi-faith council of Australia, we intend to include someone or several people from Indigenous spiritualities, because they are so important in understanding our First Peoples and their reverence for the land and so on. So, I mean, that's important. And in the Multi-Faith Council of Australia, we also intend to include people from rationalists, humanists, and ego spiritualities, because that voice is very important, very important. And I agree. The Jason Lee has raised the whole issue of trust, and I totally agree. And I hope that a Multi-Faith Council of Australia and its New South Wales equivalent can build that trust. Because I think with recent events, distrust has grown in the Australian community in a way that hasn't previously impacted upon Australia by overseas events. Yes, we had the Serbs and the Croats, the Greeks and the Turks, the Greeks and the Macedonians, but they didn't impact upon Australia as has the situation in the Ukraine, in Israel, and so on. And so we do have to build that trust. For example, the Jewish Christian Muslim JCMA Association has unfortunately folded. It was mainly based in Melbourne because Muslim and Jewish leaders would not sit around the same table. And that's why we think a broader thing like the Multi-Faith Council of Australia would overcome that sort of behavior. Another thing to think about, since 2005, I have been a member of the Victoria Police Multi-Faith Council. And so we are dealing with this issue now. In this forum, I might mention that about 3 or 4 years ago, the Victoria Police approached me worried about the impact of Modi ethno-Hindu nationalism on the Hindu community, certain sections of the Hindu community here, and the impact on Muslims here in Australia. They were worried about it. It hadn't grown to, you know, great heights, but it was a concern for the Victoria Police. And I think all police forces ought to have a multicultural and a multi-faith council group to advise the police on events as they come up, particularly the impact of overseas events on local communities here. Thank you.
You know, what is the obligation of the white Catholic towards the Hindu? And what is the obligation of the Hindu towards the white Catholic, right? So how can we really turn the thinking from, I want my rights, I am right and you're wrong, to, you know, what really are my obligations towards this community, my obligations towards this country? And I would love to have, you know, your views on this
I'd like to make several comments in taking up your point about the Hindus and the Catholics. Some theologians have worked in that area. I'm very conscious of that. Relate Dom B. Griffiths, for example. But what has happened in the Christian churches is that for the last 60 years, you've had the ecumenical movement, which was trying to bring the different Christian churches together and to be united. And that hasn't really happened. And the ecumenical movement has now run out of steam. But there is now, I think, an opportunity, and a multi-faith council could help this process of, here in Australia, the Christian communities are reaching out to the Hindus, to the Buddhists, and so on. It's happening a bit, but I think that it needs to be extended and better organized.
A quick question for you, and it's a big picture question. If this stamp out racism. So if we were to project 100 years from now, what would be your unique take on being able to stamp out racism? Because you all come from different perspectives. It's like if I had asked leading Australian thinkers 100 years back, what would be their take on stamping out racism? Is this what they would have thought, you know? So I'm just asking you some big picture questions for your vision of what you think would be the way to go.
Well, I think 100 years ago, we were at the depths of the White Australia policy, and that took such a long time to overcome. The Immigration Department started to make moves in the mid-1950s, and that naturalizing the Asian partners of Australian soldiers. There was a dispute about that in 1953. So, but then gradually there was incremental change. I think one of the important things, the politicians, I think, and the Immigration Department realized that Australia had to get rid of its White Australia policy. It was no longer viable in the 1960s or 70s and beyond, because we live in an Asian world. We're on the edge of Asia geographically. And the Immigration Department started to change in the mid-1960s when they started bringing in Anglo-Indians and Goanese from India, and in the, I'm trying to think of the term, from Sri Lanka. You know, it was the Colombo Plan, that was quite important, bringing those students, Asian students, into Australia. But they also brought in Sri Lankans who had some European heritage into Australia as a way of beginning to change Australian attitudes towards people of Asia. And so that when the change did come in late 1972, 73, and had to change because the influx of the Vietnamese refugees was just around the corner. And so we did change. And in the 80s, we developed the notion of a multicultural Australia, which unfortunately, with the Howard government, he and Costello got rid of the Office of Multicultural Affairs that I mentioned before, got rid of the Bureau of Immigration Research and so on. And I think since then, we've been struggling to have a good articulation in the contemporary world of what was true of the multicultural policy in 1989. So I think we've got a few more steps to take, really. And we've got to give a lot more thought to that. But to be very honest, we're not getting much creativity from our politicians on both sides of the political fence in reimagining Australia so that in 100 years' time, we can look back still proudly on a culturally, linguistically, racially, spiritually, religiously diverse country.
Thank you, Professor Cahill, for the census data set, 25 years. Just on the back of the census data set, I have a question as to under what religious affiliations do the Indigenous Australians fall under?
Most of them belong to a Christian denomination, but often they have this indigenous spirituality, okay? I mentioned Professor Anne Patel Gray. She belongs to the Uniting Church, but she's outspoken on the indigenous spiritualities. And I think all religious groups now have the task of incorporating indigenous spiritual practices into their own practices, okay? Whether they're Hindu or Catholic or Uniting Church or Anglican, whatever. I think that's very important, okay?
My final question is, you mentioned about JCMA getting closed up in Melbourne. So two out of three members couldn't get along. I mean, what next then?
I don't have any inside information. I was never a member of it, but it has folded up, which I think is unfortunate. And it's a symptom, as it were, of the pressures that we're now under, which Jason was talking about, and also the commissioner. So, yeah, the issue of social cohesion, that is measured every year by the Scanlon Foundation. And that's been going on since about 2007. And they've noted in the last 3 or 4 years that there's been a decline in the level of social cohesion, which has been very high to Australia's credit, but there has been a measured decline in it as well. So I would suggest to all of you to read their annual reports of the Scanlon Foundation. The other thing I'd like to mention is the notion of positive peace, and to highlight the work of the Institute of Economics and Religion. It's the organization that measures each year the Global Peace Index, okay? And it operates globally out of North Sydney, here. Under, it's associated with the Charitable Foundation and a guy called Steve Killerley. Does that name mean anything to you people here? Yes. Not many saying yes.
Yes,
Steve Killerley, he's a Buddhist. I think he was brought up as a Catholic with a name like Killerley, Steve. But he is Australia's biggest private international donor through his charitable foundation. He made his money. Now, I don't understand this. I'm not into high tech, but he developed an IT algorithm or something that is used by 50 of the 100 world's largest companies. And one application is that when you put your credit card into the ATM to get money out, his invention measures that you get your $100 and you don't get $110 or $90, okay? And it self-corrects. That's just one application of what he's invented and how he's earned so much money. He keeps an extremely low profile, but he's on all the basis of data. He's a trained mathematician with his global peace index and his positive peace index. He has this incredible array of data taken from any country in the world that has more than 1 million people. And so he's developed the notion of positive peace. And there are 8 pillars to positive peace, including a healthy business environment and the observance of human rights. And I can't remember all the 8, but Google it and see for yourself about where we might improve and strengthen the pillars of Australian society. Thank you.